ready for the next battle.
Howdy my totally as always tubular gamers, we're back for another ranking video, and today's we're going to be ranking the Tekken series. Yes, the fan favorite, much beloved 3D fighting game series. We're going to be ranking all of the main games in the Tekken series. For the uninitiated, Tekken is a 3D fighting game series that got started on the PS1 and the arcades back in the mid-90s. The series has been around for over 25 years now and spans a variety of different titles. Originally starting as kind of a Virtua Fighter clone, Tekken would quickly become its own beast entirely with an innovative control scheme and would become easily the most predominant, relevant 3D fighting game. While there have been plenty of 3D fighters throughout the years, no series has had the dominance and longevity and really just staying power that Tekken has on the entire genre. There have been a ton of games over the years, and the series is still alive and well today. Tekken has an innovative control scheme that is very unique to Tekken that has never really been replicated ever since, at least not well. While most fighting games, especially Japanese ones, will link a button to, say, punch or kick, Tekken instead links its buttons to its limbs, and you'll actually have to create the movements with the analog stick and the limbs to do the certain actions. And this really does give Tekken a unique identity and feel to it that not many other fighting games have even tried to replicate, and basically none have done successfully. There is no series like Tekken. And like every long-running fighting game franchise, Tekken has a ton of beloved characters to it. The Tekken series has dozens of different characters throughout the years in games. A lot of these characters have gone on to guest star in other games, such as Heihachi and Kazuya in Smash Bros. There's been a couple Tekken movies. There's even a Tekken anime. People love a lot of the characters of Tekken, and the actual lore and story of Tekken, it ain't half bad. But that's it for my general overview on the Tekken series. We're going to be ranking these games from worst to best. I've been a long, basically lifetime fan of Tekken, playing Tekken 3 and 4 many years ago, and are still playing Tekken to this day. These are some of my favorite fighting games of all time, and I have some really good fond memories with a lot of these games. And I can just tell you that there's no bad game on this list. There really is no bad mainline Tekken game. There are bad Tekken games, but they're not mainline Tekken games. What I mean by this is we're going to be looking at the numbered entries and including Tag Tournament 1 and 2. We're not going to be looking at any mobile games, we're not going to be looking at Street Fighter X Tekken, and we're only going to be including one version of each game since just about all of these games have multiple versions. So yeah, no spin-offs. We're going to be ranking these games based on a couple different pieces of criteria. How well do they hold up? Can you come back and actually play these games? Can you still have fun with these games? How much content do these games have relative to each other? And it's just kind of my overall feelings. Now, I'm not a super in-depth Tekken pro elitist who knows the competitive scene for each game or anything like that. This is a very casual look at. I'm just a longtime fan of the series. I've never gone competitive with any of these games except maybe Tekken 7. And we're going to keep things pretty casual. So if you have anything you want to tell me in the comments below about how I'm a casual scrub or I don't know what I'm talking about or anything like that, you got to let me know down below. And you should let me know what your favorite games are. And hey, as I was making this video, Tekken 8 has formally been announced by Bandai Namco. Really can't wait, really excited for that. This list is going to be outdated once that game comes out. Let's just say Tekken 8's the best one of them all. It's going to be the best game. Like, share, sub, all that good stuff. Now, what do I think is the weakest of the Tekken games? Now, out of all the Tekken games, I think the weakest Tekken really is the original Tekken. Now, don't get me wrong, the original Tekken is still a fine enough fighting game, even nowadays. It's just when you stack all the games up against each other, yeah, Tekken really has grown a ton since that original game. And the original game is really quite basic when compared to the rest of the series. But you also got to remember, it was the first Tekken game. Now, despite the game's simplicity, this game would really establish like everything for Tekken going forward. You would choose from a variety of different characters, and yeah, the roster isn't the most deep, especially not nowadays, but you have some of the fan favorites here like Armor King and Jack and Regular King and Paul Phoenix and Nina Williams, and of course Heihachi and Kazuma Mishima, with my favorites being King and Kazuya. And once you've chosen your character, you engage in combat. Now, it is on a one-on-one setting in a 3D environment, and 3D fighters were pretty new for the time. Other than Virtua Fighter, there really wasn't any, so you can move up and down, and you attack with your limbs, rather than what was traditionally seen in fighting games at the time. This was considered totally new. Wow, you use your limbs, it makes different combos, and it's not like Street Fighter, it's not like Mortal Kombat. No, it's totally different in that aspect. I will say though, coming back to the original Tekken after all these years, after all these other Tekken games, yeah, this game is pretty stiff, it's clunky, it doesn't feel great, and it's just aged. That's ultimately what it has aged. I mean, look at the graphics, you know the game is aged. The game looked good for the time, but nowadays we just kind of laugh at how blocky it is, and some of these cutscenes are just a total joke. And speaking of cutscenes and story, this game does actually have a story involving the Mishima family, but it really is low-key in this original game, and it's only later games that would really establish the plot for this game. And it's cool that even this original game has a story to it. Now, if you're going to play Tekken nowadays, I really sincerely doubt you're going to play the original Tekken. It has a limited roster, it doesn't feel as nice, and it just doesn't have a ton to it. It's still a good game, it's a product of its time. I still think even nowadays it is a decent game. It has aged a lot better than those old Virtua Fighter games, and I think even nowadays you can still have a fun time. And it would just be a year later actually that we would get Tekken 2 also released on the PlayStation. Now, Tekken 2 really does look at the original game and just tries to improve it in any way that it can. It added more characters, it's a lot smoother, new stages, and the console version would add some extra game modes. The game takes place 2 years after the original King of Iron Fist tournament, and again sees more strife within the Mishima family. And you know, the story, it's again not too prevalent in this original version, but later Tekken games and lore really goes over this expansive story, and it is cool. Now, when it comes to the actual fighting itself, it plays very similar to the original Tekken. It just is a bit more refined. It doesn't feel as clunky or stiff. It definitely feels a lot more smooth. You still use the limbs as always. They introduced some new attacks like attack reversals for some characters, back throws, chain throws, and even some interesting side steps. Yoshimitsu even has some new move. But yeah, this game feels a lot more in line with the Tekken that you know nowadays, and if you've played any of the later games, it shouldn't be too hard to come back to this game. It shouldn't be too jarring. The character roster has grown. Now there's 25 fighters, getting much more in line with what we'd expect from normal Tekken, with some new characters like Alex the dinosaur, Roger the kangaroo, Jack 2, Jun Kazuma. But a bunch of the characters returned from the first game like Anna Williams, King, Kuma, Paul Phoenix, the original Jack. And yeah, it's just a much stronger roster. You do actually have to unlock almost all these characters. You only start with 10 characters, so it is cool that you actually do have to play through the arcade mode and unlock a bunch of the characters. Speaking of other modes, there's more than just the arcade mode and multiplayer here. The PS1 version would introduce survival mode, a team battle mode, and even a time attack mode. And survival mode would go on to be a staple mode of the Tekken series, where you just try to defeat as many opponents as you can without being defeated yourself. And you know, these extra modes add a bit of replayability to the game and help it feel like a much more complete fighting game, especially for the time. The game looks a little bit better. It's not as chunky or blocky. And then the music, the music is so good in Tekken 2. The original game had some decent music, but Tekken 2 is when the series really kicked it into overdrive and was like, you know what, we're gonna have some kick-ass music in this series, and Tekken 2 is a great soundtrack. And you know, Tekken 2 is a pretty good fighting game. It's just like the first game. When you compare all these games to each other, Tekken 2 is lower on the list because the other games are just that much better. But I still think that, again, this is a really solid fighting game. It holds up nowadays. It's on the PS5 for some reason. And yeah, it's worth playing. And so here we have not Tekken 3, but Tekken 4, released in 2002 for the PS2, and Tekken 4 would actually be a bit different from the previous couple Tekken games, for better and for worse. Now, I know that over the years, Tekken 4 has been a little bit more mixed than some of the other Tekken games, but I still think it is a pretty good time, and it still does feel really nice. Now, surprisingly, this game actually has a very dark tone to it. It is quite edgy, and none of the other games really captured that dark tone like this game does. It takes place 2 years after King of Iron Fist Tournament 3, and is about the Mishimas again having their internal struggle with demons and Kazuya coming back, and it's really not all that different from the other games, but it actually does show up here. The plot is decently prevalent in the console version, so that's cool. Now, something that I think is totally not tubular is the character roster. This game has 23 characters, so less than even Tekken 2, and 2 of these characters are skins, Eddie Gordo for the new Christie and Panda for Kuma, so it doesn't even have 23 characters. However, even though the number of characters isn't that high, there is a few newcomers here like the mentioned Christie, Marduk, and the fan favorite Steve Fox. And so overall, I'd say the character roster is just a bit mixed, and there's a number of characters missing from the older Tekken games. At least all of these characters are very fleshed out. They all really do feel fleshed out. They added a bunch of new moves for some of these characters. And the fighting still seems pretty smooth to me. It still feels like Tekken. I will immediately say though, Tekken 4 definitely plays slower than some of the older Tekken games. It feels a bit slower and it looks a bit slower. It definitely looks more fluid. The game looks great, don't get me wrong. It just feels a bit slower than some of the other games. This was also the first Tekken game to introduce walls and really just quote environmental hazards. See, in all the other Tekken games, it really was just an endless arena that you could run infinitely around. Here, there are actual barriers and you can really get juggled up against these walls. And while I'm not the biggest fan of walls in Tekken, I understand eventually they were going to have to add walls. I mean, you can't have infinite arenas forever, so it was only a matter of time. But I would still say in general the fighting does feel pretty good. I know over the years it hasn't been the most well received thanks to some balancing and some gameplay issues, but I think the fighting is still pretty good in this game. This game also does include a beat 'em up minigame, and this is called Tekken Force. It's very similar to Tekken 3's. It's just kind of a little beat 'em up. It's nothing amazing. It's fine enough. The game even has a story mode with all the cutscenes, which is pretty cool. Tekken 4 I think is a good game still. I don't think it has the lasting impact of some of the other Tekken games, but I still think it is a fun time. I remember having a fun time with it many years ago, like over a decade ago, but you know, I think even nowadays, yeah, it's decent enough. Would I come back to it over any of the other Tekken games? Not really. Also, the music slaps so hard. The airport stage, oh, it's so good, man. It's so good. But again, it's still a fine fighting game. Alright, and so here we have Tekken 6, released for the PS3, 360, and PSP in 2009. Now, Tekken 6 was the first HD Tekken, and you know, when it comes to the presentation, I think this game looks awesome. It looks great. It looks visceral and violent, and yeah, no complaints here. It's great presentation-wise. Now, when it comes to its fighting, Tekken 6 is really what you've come to expect, especially if you played Tekken 7. It still does feel like Tekken, and it does feel very fluid. It features much bigger stages than before, and it has a lot more interactivity than its predecessors, including walls and floors that can be broken to reveal new fighting areas. And this, along with the new bounce system, leads to a lot of juggling, where you just bounce people off the floor and juggle the crap out of them to the point that it gets annoying. They also have a new rage system where characters do more damage when their health is low, not too revolutionary. And you can even customize your characters a bunch and give them some special items they can use during battle, which is interesting, and I'll leave it at that. But yeah, the fighting does feel very nice. It feels very fluid. I'm not the biggest fan of the bound system in this game. I'm not a huge fan of being juggled like crazy. Maybe that's just a skill issue on my part, but I don't love it. But at least the character roster is pretty good in Tekken 6. There's actually 39 playable characters. There's 5 new ones here, including Bob, Elisa, Lars, and even more. So yeah, I would say the roster is good. Now, if you remember, the older Tekken games had Tekken Force, like I mentioned, the little beat-em-up side mode that was maybe an hour or two at most. Well, Tekken 6 decided to do something different. It decided to make a whole story mode based around this beat-em-up mode, where you don't actually play as any of the Mishimas. Sure, the story really still is about them and their conflicts, but you actually play as someone named Lars here, who's a soldier for one of the Mishimas. However, he rebels against him and teams up with Elisa, an android, and really they just go after them. The story, it's not really that great. I mean, when it has the Mishima stuff and it's about the King of Iron Fist tournament, yeah, I think it's pretty solid and it's what you've come to expect from a Tekken storyline. But this whole stuff with Lars and Elisa, like, I don't know about any of this. I didn't really like it when I played it back then, and even nowadays I'm like, dude, this is not very good. And this story mode in general, this sucks. It was fine when Tekken Force was like a little side mode. There really wasn't much to it. It was just a little bonus. Here it really is the main focus of the single player content is this story mode. And you know, the beat 'em up gameplay, it just isn't that great. I mean, the viewing perspective is kind of weird. It doesn't control all that well, and it doesn't feel anywhere near as smooth as the fighting does. And I hate to say it, but I'm just not a fan of how these characters play. I really just did not enjoy this story mode. I remember playing it back well over a decade ago and going, wow, I don't really like this. And nowadays, come back to it, I'm like, this sucks. I don't want to play this. But yeah, I just did not enjoy the story mode, and I don't recommend it. If you're really curious, look up the cutscenes and just call it a day at that. I also remember on the PS3 version, the version I played, the load times were crap. It takes way too long to load. But hey, at least the music is pretty good. It is pretty solid. I would say Tekken 6 is still a good fighting game. It still is a pretty good game. Would I really recommend it? I'd say if you're going to play Tekken 6, you might as well really just play Tekken 7, as it is just much better in many aspects. But Tekken 6 was still a good game. Alright, and so here we have Tekken Tag Tournament coming out as a PS2 launch title in 2000. Now, Tag Tournament is a spin-off, so it doesn't really have a story, and it doesn't line up with Tekken canon or lore or any of that. No, it's about getting as many characters from the first 3 Tekken games together, teaming up to beat the crap out of each other. There are a ton of characters here, and almost every single character from the previous 3 games is here. It does even add 2 new characters, Mimic characters Tetsujin and Unknown is the final boss of this game. The character roster in this game is just superb. I really got nothing to complain about here, just praise. It has like almost every character from the first 3 Tekken games minus Gon. It has like all my favorites, and they all play just like how I remember they did. And you know, this game, when it comes to its fighting, it just plays great. It plays mostly like Tekken 3. Obviously, it looks quite a bit better than Tekken 3. This game looked great as a PS2 launch title. This was maybe the best looking game in that entire launch lineup. But yeah, this game plays great. Now, the main gameplay mechanic, if you couldn't tell from the title, is the tagging. You now choose teams of 2 characters and you can switch them in and out in the fight, and while somebody's away, they can actually regenerate some health. It's not anything too crazy, it's nothing too different from MVC, but it's great to see it in Tekken, it's great to see it in a 3D fighter, and Tekken has the roster to do so. There's a ton of different combinations you can have here. I think the tag mechanic is great, and I think this game plays super smooth. I've never had an issue picking up and playing it, and just it feels like Tekken, it plays like Tekken, and you know, it's just great. This game does have a new mode to it, Tekken Bowl, which is just this funny little mode that you can play on the side, and you know, this actually is a half decent bowling game, I won't lie. But Tekken Tag really just is a fun time. It looks great, it plays great, it has good music. It even got a remaster on the PS3 if you want a more modern console to play it, but I've always had a blast coming back to this game, and I really do think it is a great fighting game. And so here we have Tekken 5, released for the PS2 in 2005. Now, back in the day, I played a lot of Tekken 5. I've always been a big fan of Tekken 5, and I think that this is a pretty great game. Now, Tekken 5 really does listen to some of the complaints people had about Tekken 4, and while I still think Tekken 4 is a good game, this game is much better. The game plays much more like the older Tekken games. It's a lot faster than Tekken 4, it's a lot more fluid. It removes some of Tekken 4's hazardous environments like the uneven terrain. I don't know why they even had that, but it does still retain walls. They aren't as easy to abuse as they were in Tekken 4 and are a lot more balanced. And Tekken 5 even introduces its own system with the Crush system, which affects the vulnerability of a character while they attack. It's an interesting enough mechanic, and it doesn't really hamper the gameplay experience too much. Tekken 5, when it comes to its fighting, it feels a lot better than Tekken 4, and it feels much more in line with what you expect from Tekken. So the fighting is good. The story is actually pretty good in Tekken 5. It is a bit different also. It isn't just totally about the Mishima family. It just mostly is. It even introduces a new Mishima, Jinpachi Mishima, who is Heihachi's father, and you know, he's a piece of crap to fight in this game. I hate fighting this dude. And this game's character roster is also pretty solid. It has 32 characters, most of them are returning, but there are a couple new characters here. And something really cool that Tekken 5 started was all the characters no longer just speak English or Japanese. They actually speak in their native tongue, their native language, which is pretty cool. The other big thing that Tekken 5 has is the Devil Within mode. This is really the 4th installment of the Tekken 4 series because you include that stupid spin-off game Death by Degrees, and yeah, it is another beat 'em up. There's a lot of punching, kicking, throws, and even some platforming in here, and you know, this isn't the worst thing. It doesn't actually play as bad as Tekken 6's story mode. I think that this is fine enough. It is relatively harmless. It is some mindless fun. It's maybe 2 hours at most. There isn't that much to it, and you know, that's fine with me. It's not amazing. It even has some decent fan service for longtime fans, like True Ogre shows up as a boss, which I thought was cool. Again, it's relatively harmless and it doesn't really affect my standing with the game. I think Tekken 5 is a great game. I think it's maybe the best fighting game on the PS2, and I've never had anything but a great time with it. Okay, so here we got Tekken Tag Tournament 2, released in 2012 for the PS3, 360, and Wii U. Lol. Now, I remember when Tag Tournament 2 came out. I got it the day it came out. I was crazy excited for it. I was like, dude, I love the first Tag Tournament. This is going to be awesome. And this game was and still is great. They really took that original Tag Tournament and just improved it, they updated it, they beefed up the roster, and that was all that they needed to do. The game actually does have a story where Heihachi is able to get this serum that allows him to regress his appearance and power, and then he hosts another King of Iron Fist tournament. Now, Tag Tournament 2 is the biggest roster of all the Tekken games with 59 playable characters. Nearly every single playable character in Tekken's history is here. There's even a couple new characters. Yeah, no, this roster is just phenomenal. And every character has been updated in a number of different ways, especially some of the characters that have not been seen in Tekken in a long time, like Ogre. Like, they've all been updated, and it's just really cool to see like everyone here. So when it comes to the fighting, it feels like a mix of Tekken 6 and Tag Tournament 1. The general feel is Tekken 6's, with its weight, how it generally flows, and the bound system returns, and it's just as annoying as it was in Tekken 6. It might even be more annoying here, to be honest. And then it has all the tagging of Tag Tournament 1. You still choose 2 characters, you can tag them in and out, regenerate health. This game does add some new moves. It adds tag combos, it allows for combined attacks. There's some new techniques like tag assault, tag throws, and I think it's actually pretty great. You really can feel like an actual team here. In the first game, I won't lie, it kind of felt like 2 individual fighters just going back and forth. In this game, it definitely feels a lot more synchronized and more like, you know, an actual team. I really like these mechanics. And there's actually some variation you can have here. You can have 2v2, 1v2, and you can even have 4 separate players all fighting each other. Yeah, this is 4-player Tekken thanks to the tag attacks, which is really cool. And then when it comes to this game's presentation and music, oh, it's superb. It is great. It is some of the best on the PS3. I really think Tag Tournament 2 is just a stellar fighting game. It's still a really fun time. I have no problem picking it up and playing it nowadays, and I have no problem recommending it, especially because of its amazing roster. And the only reason that this game isn't higher on the list or like the top spot is because, again, I'm not big on the bounce system. I think you bounce a little too much in this game. You can just get juggled all hell. Maybe it's a skill issue, don't know, but was not huge on that. Still is a great game. Also, the single player, a little lacking for a PS3 game, but still, again, Tag Tournament 2, no problem recommending it, a great fighting game. Alright, we're in goated territory now. Here we have the legendary Tekken 3 released in 1998 for the PS1. Tekken 3 really is considered a landmark game for fighting games and considered one of the very best fighting games of all time. And you know, all these years later, Tekken 3 holds up remarkably. It really is impressive how good Tekken 3 still is after all these years and how it absolutely still holds up. You can still pick up and play this game like it was the 90s and it still feels just, even with modern fighting games. This game still feels great, it still plays great, it is that Tekken gameplay you know and love. Outside of jumping higher, Tekken 3 doesn't even really add anything all that new to the series. They really just refined Tekken 2's gameplay. They made it a lot smoother, more fluid. It looks a lot better, it plays better, and you know, it just feels really great. I really just can't get past the feel. It's not stiff, it's just so great. It is the best feel for any fighting game on the PS1, hands down, and maybe the best of any fighting game from the 90s. Seriously, it's that good. Now, when it comes to the character roster, there are 21 characters here. However, only 6 of them are returning characters. Almost everyone is new. Not even Kazuya returns. And a lot of these new characters are just some of the best characters Tekken's ever had. Like Brian Fury, my main Eddie Gordo, Forrest Law, Harong, Jin, Julia, Kuma 2, King 2, and of course Ogre. It is crazy how many iconic characters were introduced in Tekken 3, and while it doesn't have as many characters as Tekken 2, again, almost all of them are new, and they're so good that I don't even care that the number's a little lower. And the story takes place after Tekken 2 and is about another King of Iron Fist tournament, about Jin and Heihachi really going after this mysterious creature known as Ogre. I think it's probably the best story Tekken's ever told. I think it is actually pretty great. And you know, there's a reason when the Tekken anime was going to go off a story in Tekken, you knew they were going to choose Tekken 3 because it's the fan favorite, it's probably the best story the series has ever had, and it actually makes sense. The game is a pretty great arcade mode to go through. It might be the best in like the whole series. And then on the PS1 version, they did introduce some new mini games. They have Tekken Force. This is the first time it ever showed up. It's from a side-scrolling perspective, which is probably the best perspective, honestly, of all these Tekken Force mini games. It's a fine little beat 'em up. It's decent enough. And it's crazy that you play this and you're like, wow, this actually controls well enough and it's actually fun. And you go to Tekken 6 all those years later and it's like, how did they mess this up so bad? It's because Tekken 3 is like the best, baby. It's so good. They also have Tekken Ball, which is very similar to beach volleyball, where you're just hitting the ball back and forth. But I promise that this is a lot more fun than I just made it sound. I've had a lot of fun with friends in the past. And I've had just a ton of fun with Tekken 3 with friends in the past. Every couple years I usually return to Tekken 3 because it's just so good. It's easy to pick up and play, it's hard to master. Anybody who's played Tekken can pick it up and play it just fine. Anybody who's not even all that familiar with fighting games will have fun with Tekken 3. Tekken 3 was the first Tekken I played and I just fell in love with the game. I thought it was just fantastic and I had never played a fighting game that I was so into that wasn't Smash. Maybe it's just personal bias, maybe it's just nostalgia why it's so high on this list, but I think Tekken 3 is still a wonderful game. It is a superb fighting game that absolutely should be played. Even if you just want to play modern Tekken, no, I promise you Tekken 3 is still really good. Sure, it doesn't have a bunch of the fancy mechanics that some of the later Tekken games have, but it doesn't need them. The core gameplay is just so good, and you know what? We're going to be here all day if I talk about my memories with Tekken 3. It's a great game, it's a fantastic fighting game that is totally worth playing, but what's the best Tekken game? It's probably pretty obvious. Yeah, I do think that the best Tekken game of them all is the latest Tekken game as of this moment, Tekken 7, released for the PS4, Windows, and Xbox One in 2017. I think Tekken 7 is just one of the very best fighting games like ever made. And I'm not just saying Tekken 7 is the best Tekken because it's the latest and greatest. I would not say Street Fighter V is better than some of the older Street Fighter games. Tekken 7 really just looks at all the other Tekken games and really takes something, the best parts of all the Tekken games, and combines them all together to create just a superb experience. I would go as far as to say that Tekken 7 is the best 3D fighting game ever made. Seriously, I just absolutely love it. I've not put so much time into a fighting game as I have with Tekken 7 outside of some Smash Brothers games, and it's probably my favorite fighting game like of all time with Smash. When it comes to Tekken 7's flow, how it feels, how it plays, I think it's just the best. It has the best elements of Tekken 6 and Tag Tournament 2, removes some of the fluff, adds some new systems of its own to create just a fantastic experience. It is crazy smooth, it's fluid, the animation is amazing. When it comes to the presentation, it is unparalleled. This game still looks absolutely phenomenal. And I just think that the fighting has just gotten better and better over the years, especially as they updated Tekken 7 and added new mechanics. This game introduces a number of new things to the Tekken series, like the Rage Arts, which kind of acts like a final move when you get low on health. I've always thought this is great and it's super fun to use. It has this thing called Power Crush where you're able to absorb opponents' hits, and then it has Screw Hits, which basically replaces the bound mechanic, and I think that this is a lot better. You're not going to be bouncing all over the place like Tekken 6 and Tag Tournament 2. The juggling is kept to a minimum. Okay, maybe not a minimum, but it's less than the previous two games, and I just think that it's really the best balance that the series has ever had. And I think that this game has the best stages probably of the whole series. A lot of them are really balanced. Of course, my favorite's going to be Infinite Azure because I've just always been a fan of those big open stages of Tekken, but I think like a lot of the stages are good here. I know I didn't really talk about stages in the previous games. Most of them were good, but Tekken 7, ooh, they got the best stages. And then when it comes to the characters, we have probably the best roster Tekken's had. It rivals Tag Tournament 2. It is 54 playable fighters when you include the palette swaps. And a number of them are DLC, but there are some really good characters here. There's some really cool new characters. There's some even interesting guest characters like Negan and Noctis. But I can assure you all of these characters are incredibly fleshed out. These are the most fleshed out that these characters have ever been. They have so many combos. Like, so many of these characters have just so many different moves and strings and chains. It's really great how many different just approaches you can have with each character. I think it's really cool. Oh yeah, and then Akuma from Street Fighter is here for some reason, and you know, I've never really been a big fan of Akuma being in this game. I don't like his projectiles. I don't really like projectiles in Tekken, and one of my favorite things about Tekken is that there really is no projectiles. But I mean, as long as nobody plays Akuma, I guess it's cool. Akuma does play a large part in the story here as well. The story continues on from Tekken 6, and I'll be real, the story just doesn't make a ton of sense here. It's about the Mishima family still fighting and really dragging the whole world into chaos, it seems, and then Akuma showing up trying to stop things. It just gets a bit ridiculous here, and the story mode was fine enough, but it gets hard as balls at the end, and I'll really just leave it at that. It gets absolutely hard as balls. The story mode was interesting enough, though. There's the arcade mode. They did add Tekken Bowl, and you know, the single player content is actually pretty decent here. And then you have the online. Now, online is not new to Tekken, obviously, but I won't lie, the online in Tekken 6 and Tag Tournament 2 wasn't amazing. It was fine enough, a little laggy. Tekken 7 has the best online the series has ever seen. I have spent a ton of time online. Most of my time has been playing online in this game. I just really love how this game feels. I love how it looks. I love the online. The load times are still stupidly long, and I think that this game is just really goated for me. I think the roster's great, the gameplay's great. Again, the online is pretty good. I never really had any issues with it. I think the game it seems pretty balanced to me, and I just have not put so much time into a fighting game like I have with Tekken 7. I really just love Tekken 7. What a fun time. I've never not had a fun time. Even when I'm getting my absolute ass beat online by these pros, it's still a great time. Tekken 7, when it comes to great fighting games, man, I just always think of Tekken 7 pretty much at this point. I'm just like, where is the next Tekken? Because Tekken 7 is so good. How do you build on Tekken 7? Well, we're getting Tekken 8 now, so we'll see how they build on it. Tekken 7, they've improved so much throughout the years too. That's another thing. Maybe that gives it a cheap edge that they've actually been able to update it and add more to it, but hey, Tekken 7, just a fantastic game. What's everyone's favorite Tekken? I'd love to know your favorite Tekken. Maybe I'm just a boring person by having the newest one on here, but I just love Tekken 7, man. Anyway, that's it for this video. Hope everyone has a good day, Christmas, night, whatever it is. See everyone later. Bye.